Good evening, dear Medyascope viewers. Welcome to This Week in Turkey. This evening, our guest is freelance journalist Jennifer Hattam. We will be looking back at the Gezi Park protests on its 7th anniversary, as well as speak about the current protests that have spread across the United States. But first, let's take a look at this week's developments. As of June 4th, the death toll from the coronavirus has reached 4,630, while the number of confirmed cases has reached 167,410. While the reopening process is underway, a weekend curfew in 15 provinces was announced by the Interior Minister. Yet this morning, President Erdogan overruled this decision and tweeted that he canceled said curfew because, quote, he couldn't find it in his heart to do it, end quote. Here are the coronavirus-related developments of the week.
Turkey reopened restaurants, cafes, and parks on June 1st and lifted intercity travel restrictions. The government has been gradually easing the restrictive measures for the past few weeks as authorities say the outbreak is now under control. With these reopenings, traffic congestion in Istanbul reached 26% by 7:30 a.m. on June 1st. Turkish Airlines' first commercial flight to run in 59 days took off from Istanbul Airport to Ankara on June 1st. While the 156 passengers were seated at a distance from each other, everyone in the aircraft wore masks. Minister of Transportation and Infrastructure Adil Karaismailoğlu made a statement on June 4th announcing that they're planning to gradually resume international flights to 40 countries as of June 10. The international flights from Turkey will carry passengers firstly to the Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus, Bahrain, Bulgaria, Qatar, and Greece, Adil Karaismailoğlu had said in a statement. Karaismailoğlu reminded that, as part of the decisions taken by the Ministry of Health on May 20th, the citizens arriving in Turkey from abroad will be isolated in their homes for a period of 14 days after they are examined at the airports. Following a meeting with the Coronavirus Science Committee on June 3rd, Health Minister Fahrettin Koca said that Turkey does not expect a second wave of coronavirus infections. Koca, however, warned that the normalization period does not mean citizens can be able to return to their old way of living, saying that the outbreak has not ended. Koca reiterated the importance of abiding by the rules of face masks and social distancing amid normalization.
On June 2nd, the Turkish parliament reconvened after a 45-day break. On June 4th, 3 opposition deputies were stripped from their MP statuses. The next day, Turkish authorities arrested them.
Upon the Turkish parliament reopening on June 2nd, the AKP and the MHP have put aside pressing regulations, including those that could soften the economic fallout of the coronavirus pandemic, and is proposing a vast array of legislations instead. These include expanding the powers of watchmen and the political parties law. On June 4th, People's Democratic Party lawmakers Leyla Güven and Musa Farisoğulları and Republican People's Party deputy Enis Berberoğlu were stripped of their statuses as members of parliament. The decision was read by Deputy Parliament Speaker Süreyya Sadi Bilgiç amid protests from the party's seats. Both Güven and Farisoğulları were tried in the main Kurdistan Communities Union case and were handed 6 and 9 years in prison, respectively. Berberoğlu was sentenced to 5 years and 10 months in jail in the case into a story on National Intelligence Agency trucks filled with weapons bound for Syria in early 2014. He was accused of providing footage of the trucks to journalist Can Dündar and was arrested. While the final court rulings were issued earlier, no steps were taken by the government to strip them of their statuses until today. CHP Group Deputy Chair Engin Altay said that stripping deputies of their statuses is a coup against people's will. After Bilgiç read the rulings, deputies chanted slogans against fascism, condemning the AKP for being putschists.
This year marks the 7th anniversary of the Gezi Park protests.
Thousands of Twitter users marked the day via sharing pictures and quotes from the landmark demonstrations, while also commemorating those killed by police. Taksim Solidarity came together on İstiklal Avenue in Taksim on June 1st. The group intended to make a statement to both commemorate the ones who lost their lives in Gezi and to celebrate the protest in its 7th year. However, the police did not permit the press statement to be made on İstiklal Avenue and instead was done on Miss Street. The street was closed on both ends by the police. Opening a banner that read, "Life can only fit into Gezi," in reference to "Life fits into the home," the motto of the health ministry against the coronavirus, the group also chanted the slogans, "Everywhere Taksim, everywhere resistance. There is no salvation alone, either all together or none of us." We will struggle and win. And the martyrs of Gezi is our honor. The statement was also attended by People's Democratic Party MP Oya Ersoy, main opposition Republican People's Party Istanbul MP Ali Şeker, CHP İstanbul Provincial Chair Canan Kaftancıoğlu, HDP İstanbul Provincial Co-Chairs Elif Bulut and Erdal Avcı, Confederation of Progressive Trade Unions of Turkey Chair Arzu Çerkezoğlu, and People's Democratic Congress Co-Chair Sedat Şenoğlu. Reading out the press statement on behalf of Taksim Solidarity, lawyer Can Atalay said, "The darkness that took Berkin, Ethem, Medeni, Ali Ismail, Hasan Ferit, Abdullah, Ahmet and Mehmet away from us in Gezi is the same darkness that stopped George Floyd's breath." Meanwhile, main opposition leader Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu shared a video on social media to commemorate the 7th anniversary of Gezi. The video montage of footage from the protests was overlaid with an audio where Kılıçdaroğlu is heard reading a poem by Turkish poet Nazım Hikmet. "It's not about falling hostage, it's about never turning yourself in," Kılıçdaroğlu tweeted along with the video, citing a line from another poem by Hikmet. The Gezi Park protests of 2013 initially began as a reaction to renovation plans of the ruling Justice and Development Party, which aimed to construct a mall or artillery barracks on the city's few remaining green spots. A small group of environmentalists from Taksim Solidarity gathered in the park and refused to leave to prevent the cutting down of trees on May 27, 2013, after construction efforts began overnight. The group became larger on May 28th, as politicians also visited the protesters to halt demolition in the area. As police brutality increased, thousands head to the area to protest. Initially centered in Istanbul, the protests spread to all over Turkey starting from June 1, as millions took to the streets to raise their voices against police brutality and government policies. It turned into the largest wave of protests against the government in Turkey's history.
This evening, our guest is Jennifer Hattam. Jennifer is an experienced freelance journalist based in Istanbul. Her articles have been published in many print and online outlets, including The Washington Post, The National, and Deutsche Welle. Hi, Jennifer. Thank you for joining us this evening.
Thank you for having me.
So this year is the 7th anniversary of Gezi. As per tradition, Taksim and Şişhane metro stations were stopped at 4 p.m. on June 1st, and the park was barricaded to prevent entries. Nonetheless, Taksim Solidarity was able to come together and read a press statement, even though they too were barricaded from both sides of the street on Mis Sokak. So since 2013, to ask broadly, what has changed in Turkey? I know this is a very general question, but perhaps we can start by considering, Istanbul's transformation. If we consider that Gezi initially was, its starting point at least was to protect green spaces against urban renewal in Istanbul.
Yeah, like you said, I mean, this is a question we could discuss for hours, of course. But I think the crackdown on the use of public space has been one of the most visible changes we've seen. I first moved to Istanbul in 2008, and there was basically a protest on Istiklal every weekend, and very lightly impacted by police. People would march and chant and carry their signs, and of course we don't see that anymore. So we can't entirely separate that from the other things that have gone on in the years since Gezi. Of course, there has been this crackdown on protests and on public expression more generally, but we've also experienced a lot of terror attacks. There have been some reasons to amp up security, although of course, as we see, in countries around the world, things like security issues can be used to further clamp down on expression and the way people respond in public space. So up until, I guess, a year or two ago, and in the case of the Women's March, and maybe another year before that in the case of the Pride Parade, I mean, you had these two big events that were still allowed to go on, and now even those have been squelched. So, I mean, you really see a change in how people are able to use the space in Istanbul. When you talked about the green spaces and Taksim Gezi specifically, I mean, Taksim has been a contested space, I would say, probably since it was created. I mean, the whole architecture of the space, the way it was laid out, the kinds of buildings that were there, the idea of this sort of public promenade, this all reflected the beliefs of the political leaders in the early republic, that they were kind of looking towards this Europeanized idea of modernity, and that's what they wanted to reflect there. And now the political party in power now has a different idea of what they want to reflect, building the large mosque, redoing the Ataturk Cultural Center. And you really, like you said, even though Gezi is still there, it's changed. It's more frequently blocked off by police. There's kind of a regular police sort of station almost up there. And we saw really very recently how contested this space still is. I guess it was just before the coronavirus kind of shut things down. The newish mayor of Istanbul from the opposition party had started this project of Kavuşma Durak, which is, I guess, like gathering point, coming together point. And he had created this sort of usable public sculpture in Taksim where people could meet and talk and have events and see the space from an elevated perspective. And underneath there was an exhibition about the history of Taksim to try to kind of re-envision the square for the future. And very quickly that was declared to be off limits by I guess it was the governor, and which is connected with the ruling party. And then pretty soon it was taken down. So I mean, you do still see the space being quite contested.
Indeed. You mentioned that, public expression in and of itself has also been, prohibited due to the increase of police violence and so forth. And one of the striking characteristics of the Gezi protest was that it was kind of like this all-inclusive space where, everyone came together from a wide range of political beliefs and stood kind of hand in hand to counter this police violence. And yet protest culture has changed. There's been, obviously many repercussions to civil society where people have lost their jobs. Osman Kavala, even though he's been acquitted from the Gezi, accusations, supposedly, he's still in prison. So how have you seen, I guess, kind of this solidarity transform since the park and adapted into our daily reality?
Yeah, no, I mean, this has definitely been a very difficult period for civil society and for political opposition in Turkey, although, of course, certainly not the first one. I was very struck when I first came here and started talking to people working in activism, how sort of fresh the 1980 coup was in their memory and how much they talked about the impact that had on civil society, even up until this day. And younger people than me who participated in Gezi, a lot of them said that their parents, who had been young people around the time of the 80 coup, had kind of instilled in them this idea that they should keep their head down and not rise up too much because the repercussions were so bad at that time. So there was a bit of a sense of this new energy around Gezi, that people were feeling more vocal and, like you said, coming together in different ways. I mean, kind of mentioning the Pride Parade again, because that was very striking to me. The one that was held in 2013, right after, kind of still during the Gezi protests, was so enormous. And there was such a move from other groups to say, hey, our LGBT brothers and sisters supported us in Gezi. We were all there together. Let's be there for them. And that was really, quite a nice thing to see. Obviously, it's harder to have that kind of solidarity now. Like I said, people are being imprisoned. There's crackdown on press freedom as well as on expression on social media. But, for as fraught as it is, I do think you still see some impacts of that in the electoral coalitions that there has been between the main opposition, CHP, and the Kurdish party, HDP. I mean, this has been very fraught. It hasn't always been successful. But it did help get HDP into the parliament in 2015. So my memory fails me sometimes. And it helped, many people feel, get some of these opposition mayors into power in big cities more recently. So, I mean, I think there are some elements of those coalitions and of that sense of possibility that remain alive. And I think I do also see that civil society is still really active. I mean, maybe they're not as political in a classic way, kind of out in the streets like they used to be, but there's a lot of solidarity among environmental movements. People in Istanbul saying, there's a common cause between the risk to our northern forests here in the city and to to the Kazdağları in the North Aegean and to what's going on in the Kachkar Mountains. I mean, that we all have some solidarity with each other in no small part because a lot of this environmental destruction is being carried out by the same companies underneath the same approval from the government. And then you also see things like all the volunteers that came out to monitor elections, these citizen journalism initiatives or fact-checking initiatives, the assistance that people have given to their fellow citizens during coronavirus, which like some of the opposition municipalities put together so people can pay each other's utility bills anonymously, or even going back to the terrible Ankara train station bombing in 2015, there was a big sense that the government wasn't helping those people who were killed or injured in those protests, but citizens came out to donate blood, to provide supplies, to feed and house people. So I like to think things are not dead; they're just taking a different form.
Yeah. So coincidentally, our seventh commemoration of Gezi has coincided with the eruption of protests in the United States. As a matter of fact, the activist lawyer Can Atalay, during the press statement read during the commemoration ceremony, draw parallels between the darkness that killed George Floyd and those that were killed during the Gezi Park protests. Now, President Erdogan has also shown support for the protesters in the United States this week, condemning the fascist and racist approach against the protesters. And it wasn't only him. Minister of Foreign Affairs Mevlut Çavuşoğlu, presidential spokesperson Fahrettin Altun, all have shown their support for the protesters, for press freedom, and so forth. So when we read these statements, what we can come to the conclusion that Erdogan perhaps firmly stands in support of every protest against injustice. Yet last year, when the Yellow Vests were protesting in France, his reaction was substantially different, where he was drawing perhaps more parallels between the protests of the Yellow Vests and the Gezi Park protests. So what do you make of the Turkish government's support of the current protests in the United States?
Yeah, I mean, I think importantly, these types of responses, whether from Turkey or other countries, don't necessarily say so much about the actual content of the protests or who is protesting. They say maybe more about the relationship between the two countries or what kind of way that Turkey or another country wants to position itself. And in some ways, Turkey's response to what happened in France and what's happening now in the U.S. is not so different. I mean, in both cases, what I saw was Turkish officials use this as an opportunity to call out a hypocrisy that they see or want other people to see in the West. You were criticizing us for, our police response to Gezi. Why aren't you criticizing Macron and the police in France for their response to the Yellow Vests? You criticized us for how we've handled press freedom. Why are you not criticizing Trump? So, I mean, there are some similarities in that way, and I think this is quite a common rhetorical tactic to point to the West and to say, well, these things happen there too, and they're hypocrites for always criticizing Turkey. And I mean, there are some fair points to that as well. And this isn't just Turkey. I mean, this is something that Russia does, that other countries do as well. Specifically with the racial strife and the racial brutality that's going on in the U.S. I mean, that was something that the Soviet Union really pointed to during the Cold War, to say, like, America's not that great. I mean, and this is a major flaw in the U.S. I mean, a major challenge that we are still really struggling with. In addition to that, I think it's probably kind of speculation to say whether or not the Turkish government officials identify with the protests in the U.S. or not. I mean, some people have kind of suggested that Erdogan sort of sees his supporters as and himself as an oppressed class in Turkey in the same way maybe that African Americans are in the U.S. And he has used some rhetorical devices in the past to kind of make that comparison. So there could be something to that. But I think we also have to kind of remember that this solidarity really has its limits. I mean, there was a small protest here in Istanbul and Kadıköy a few days ago, in solidarity with the protests in the US, and that was dispersed by police. So, it's fine for the officials to make those statements, but maybe not so fine for people to come out in the streets about it.
Yeah. Speaking of rhetoric, many observers have also noticed that Trump's rhetoric reminds them of Erdogan's way of handling the Gezi Park protests in 2013. So his language, for example, has provoked even more anger, and the police responded with a huge show of force, deploying tear gas and rubber bullets against the protester. Erdogan is also remembered for using negative and provocative language that divided Turkey into two camps. And there's also this use of religious symbols, including Trump's holding the Bible at the door of the church, which is reminiscent of Erdogan's behavior when he brandished the Quran and tried to portray the protests as irreligious. So do you think, especially now looking at the increasingly authoritarian path Turkey has taken since Gezi, will Erdogan's Gezi playbook work for Trump, even though obviously the two situations are very, very different from each other?
Yeah, like you said, it's impossible to overemphasize that the cultural dynamics are really different, the societal dynamics, and the causes of the protests, of course, are extremely different. But with the timing does make it very easy to draw some parallels, as well as the, a lot of the visuals and the rhetoric. I mean, Gezi was really quite a small sit-in in the park for 3 or 4 nights. And it was really only the police response to it, the burning of the protesters' tents every morning, the tear gassing of people that kind of brought such a massive amount of people out onto the streets. So in addition to that, police violence and this kind of militarized police, riot gear, tomas, tear gas, all that you see in both places, like I said, the rhetoric is quite similar and is a kind of rhetoric that we're seeing in a lot of countries around the world as leaders take on these more authoritarian tones. So I think in both cases you have a bit of a refusal to recognize the protest as kind of a genuine public outpouring. Erdogan often would talk about outside agitators. Trump blames the Democrats, the opposition political party, for sort of there's something they're trying to cook up ahead of the elections to bring him down. And you also really see in both countries that there's this sense that they want to promote that the people who are protesting are not real citizens. They're not real Turks. They're not real Americans. In Turkey, they're terrorists. They're çapulcu. In the U.S., they're thugs. So they're kind of not worthy of the same treatment, the same consideration. And this is kind of that majoritarianism that you see in a lot of places around the world. That only the people who supported. Okay, we have a democracy. We've elected a leader, but only the people who voted for them are worthy of rights, of good treatment. So there is quite a similarity there. And also the similarity in terms of blaming the media. Although I think you do still see, the media is able to operate more freely in the US. So you are seeing more and more honest depictions of the protests. And I don't have the numbers at hand, but I saw some things a couple days ago that indicated that the support for the protests in the US is higher now than the support generally for the protests was during Gezi, which could say something about what people are learning through the media. Yeah. The religious question, that's a whole nother one. Like, it's so cynical with Trump. He's such not a devout man at all. He had a famous interview where he said his favorite book was the Bible, but he couldn't even say a single verse from it. His actions are not that of a religious person at all. I think anyone who thinks he is on the side of the religious movement in the US is really kind of cynical themselves, and they're just using him to get their own power. So that to me feels quite different, even though maybe some of the optics are similar. In terms of what happens next, it's really hard to say. This does feel a bit desperate on the part of Trump right now. There's election coming up really soon. He was already being really heavily criticized for how the US has responded to coronavirus. It's been a disaster. So amping up these divisions might feel like a strategy for him. Mm-hmm. And I think that a lot depends on what the opposition does. And that's not so different from Turkey either. Mm-hmm. A lot of the people on the streets in the US, they weren't going to vote for Trump. But if the Democrats don't give them a good support, give them a good response, they may not vote at all. And that's what we were always sort of struggling with. Like, they're not going to vote for Trump or not for Trump based on this, but they may just stay home and feel like the political process doesn't have anything to offer them.
As you mentioned, I mean, these protests are not only, supported widely in the United States, but also around the world as well. We've seen solidarity demonstrations in various different countries, including Istanbul, as you also mentioned, where the protesters were detained by the police. Do you think, I mean, when we look back, especially at 2013, when the Occupy movements, slowly started to grow, and there were waves of protests all around the world. Do you see this moment, especially also perhaps accentuated by the inequalities that the global pandemic has amplified? Do you see a similar kind of worldwide wave appearing, or?
Yeah, it's always so hard to know when these long simmering issues are going to burst out, right? I mean, Gezi was hardly the first protest. There had been, the protest about the demolition of MX Cinema, for just one example. There had already been kind of a sense of, things being a bit repressed before that exploded. And of course, in the US, police brutality against African Americans is nothing new at all. And there have been numerous big protests over the past few years about deaths at the hand of police. And some of them have been pretty big, but nothing like this. I mean, I don't think we've seen anything like this since the 60s. So it's really hard to know when something is going to explode in this same way. But like you said with Occupy, and like we're kind of been seeing in the last couple of years too, there's a really interesting kind of globalization of protests going on in some ways. There's a lot of similarities in terms of methods or presentation. I mean, so one thing that was interesting to me to see was, really right after the protests started bursting out in the US, I was seeing people online from Turkey, from Lebanon, from Hong Kong, being like, hey, we were here before. This is how you handle tear gas. This is what you should take to a protest. This is how you kick the tear gas canister away from you. I mean, this is how you get your voice out when you can't, do it through your normal channels. So it seems like maybe, in part through social media, there is kind of a growing solidarity where people are, wanting, kind of seeing the common cause, seeing some similarities between their protests, even if the issues are really different. And, and so then they start to kind of look similar in some ways too. I mean, we saw during Gezi that, people set up these first aid stations. I remember there was even like a pet hospital in Gezi, and they're cooking food for free and having entertainment and yoga classes. And, we saw that in Lebanon and Iraq last year. And, we saw similar things in Hong Kong. And so there is a real internationalization of the protests to go along with some of this kind of internationalization of authoritarianism. Mm-hmm. But I guess the flip side to that is, it's not always easy for any of us, to criticize what goes on in our own societies. And in that way, I think, what the Turkish officials say in pointing out the hypocrisy of the West, I mean, really does have merit to it. It's easy for Americans or Europeans to look at Turkey and criticize what's going on here and maybe not look so much at what's going on there. And conversely, I mean, I'm already seeing kind of a backlash to people saying, okay, it's great that you in Turkey, in the Middle East, wherever, are coming out to protest what's happening in the US, but look at, what are you doing about the racism or the discrimination in your own society, whatever form that takes. I mean, maybe it's not against Black people, but it could be against someone else in society. So, it's hard to know if this will turn into a reckoning with what's going on in people's own societies or not. But the police violence is quite an interesting driver for that, I think, because one of the other things I remember from Gezi that really stood out was that I think a lot of people who joined Gezi had never really experienced any kind of state violence or repression before. And they were kind of having these moments where they realized that, hey, maybe stuff that's been going on in the Kurdish Southeast or against leftists or against other LGBT, other marginalized groups, this is real, this is happening, and now it's affecting me. And I think we're seeing that in the US too. I mean, this police violence against Black communities, this marginalization, this economic deprivation, this is old stuff, but a lot of people who are now in the protests had never experienced that firsthand. So in some ways, maybe the way that the police are responding will create more solidarity and more understanding of what's going on within our own societies.
Yes, and as you said, I really do hope it becomes a moment for many of us to look in the mirror and face what is happening in our very own communities and countries. Jennifer Hattam, thank you so much for joining us this evening.
Thank you for having me.
The Hrant Dink Foundation released a written statement for the press and announced that Raquel Dink, the wife of late journalist Hrant Dink, and the attorneys of the foundation received death threats via email on May 27th and 28th, since 2 people have been arrested.
The email included the phrase, "We may turn up one night when you least expect it," a slogan used boastfully in certain circles, and the very same slogan we were well used to hearing before Hrant Dink was so publicly assassinated, and with the knowledge of official bodies, on January 19th, 2007. The threat accuses the Hrant Dink Foundation of telling tales of fraternity, demands us to leave the country, and threatens Raquel Dink and the foundation's lawyer with death, the foundation said in a statement. Dink was shot dead on January 19th, 2007, in front of the apartment where Turkish-Armenian weekly newspaper Agos's main office was located on the Halaskar Gazi street of the Shishli district in Istanbul. Dink was outspoken on the Armenian genocide and was prosecuted a number of times under the Turkish Penal Code for denigrating Turkey and insulting Turkish identity. Ogün Samast confessed to the killing and was sentenced to almost 23 years in jail back in 2011. The case grew into a wider scandal after it emerged that security forces had been aware of a plot to kill Dink but failed to act. Relatives and followers of the case have long claimed government officials, police, military personnel, and members of the National Intelligence Agency played a role in Dink's murder by neglecting their duty to protect the journalist. The death threat to the foundation comes in the aftermath of 2 recent attacks on Armenian churches in Istanbul. An assailant on May 22nd ripped off a cross outside Surp Krikör Lusarovic Armenian Church in Üsküdar's Kuzguncuk neighborhood, whereas another attempted to burn the entrance door of another Armenian Orthodox church in Bakırköy on May 8th.
Başak Demirtaş, the wife of People's Democratic Party former co-chair Selahattin Demirtaş, has said that his letters from Edirne prison have been censored.
Demirtaş shared the pictures of the censored letters on her Twitter, with the following statement addressed to Justice Minister Abdülhamit Gül. Face-to-face visits have been suspended. No opportunities have been provided for video chat. And now, censorship. What's next? On the pictures of letters shared by Demirtaş, the words 2020/208 Disciplinary Board can be read. The readable part of the letter included Selahattin Demirtaş's wishes for the pandemic to end soon.
20-year-old Barış Çakan was stabbed to death in the Etimesgut district of the capital Ankara on May 31st. The motive behind Çakan's murder created controversy, with initial reports saying that he was killed in a racially motivated murder. Çakan's family denied such claims on June 1st.
Speaking to Medyascope correspondent Hazar Dost, Nihat Çakan, the father of Barış Çakan, said that his son was not attacked because he was listening to Kurdish music, as initially reported, but because he warned the suspects for listening to loud music in their car while the call to prayer was recited. Those 3 people were in a car listening to music. The call to prayer was performed at the time. My son's friend told them to turn the volume down due to the prayers. They said, "Are you teaching me Islam?" in return, and the fight erupted, Çakan said. Some 15 minutes after my son left the house to meet his friend called me and told me that there was a fight. He said, "I escaped, but I can't see Barış." We went out and saw ambulances. He was stabbed by 3 people, Çakan added. Taken into custody as part of the investigation launched by the Ankara Western Chief Public Prosecutor's Office, 3 people have been arrested by court order.
That's all from This Week in Turkey. See you next Friday at 9 p.m. Good night.